Right, let's dive straight into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the most complex, long-standing geopolitical puzzles in the modern world, the traditional boundary dispute between India and China. We are going to look at this through a purely analytical lens, tracing the history, the geography, and the legal arguments laid out in our source documents to really understand the architecture of this entire standoff. But before we start sketching out any lines on a map, we really have to ask ourselves a pretty fundamental question. Who actually defines a border? Is it history and these ancient treaties? Is it the physical, rugged geography of the Earth itself? Or, at the end of the day, is it ultimately just raw power? Keep that question in the back of your mind, because it is the exact lens through which both of these nations view this incredibly high-altitude frontier. So here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll quickly cover the anatomy of a border, map out the 3 specific boundary sectors, do a deep dive into the Western and Eastern claims, check out the 1960 evidence board, and then wrap up with what we call the boundary dispute formula. Okay, part 1, the anatomy of a border, and just understanding the sheer scope of this thing. Let's start with the actual scale of what's being contested up there on the roof of the world, because it is literally massive. According to the source documents, we are talking about a 3,440-kilometer traditional boundary. To put that into perspective, that stretches all the way from northwest Kashmir right down to the tri-junction where India, Burma, and China meet. And across this massive, incredibly rugged expanse, the texts note that China claims roughly 13,000 square kilometers of territory that India firmly considers its own. Moving to part 2, the 3 border sectors. Let's map out this conflict. To even begin to make sense of a frontier this big, we kind of have to chop the map up into 3 distinct geographical theaters. So looking from west to east, the dispute is cleanly broken down into 3 areas. On the far left, you've got the western sector up near Ladakh. Right in the middle is the central sector bordering places like Uttar Pradesh and Himachal Pradesh. And then on the right, the eastern sector, which is historically referred to as the Northeast Frontier Agency, or NIFA. Now, while the central sector has definitely seen some smaller claims, it's really the western and eastern sectors where the heaviest historical and strategic weight truly sits. Which brings us to part 3, the western sector, specifically Aksai Chin and its historical progression. Now, what's really fascinating here is that we can trace the roots of this Western standoff back for centuries. India maintains that the boundary here is defined by what's called the Johnson Line. This covers Ladakh and the Aksai Chin Plateau. Now, geographically speaking, this is a harsh, high-altitude desert, but strategically, it's an absolutely vital area for regional connectivity. The core disagreement is basically this. China contends the Sino-Indian boundary has actually never been formally delimited and requires fresh, modern negotiation. India, on the flip side, argues the boundary has already been firmly established by centuries of custom and very specific treaties. Let's look at the actual historical timeline India uses to back this up, as detailed in our sources. India points all the way back to 1580, when Ladakh was under Skardu rulers, and a peace treaty in 1684. But the real anchor of their argument is an 1842 treaty involving the Maharaja of Jammu and Kashmir and the Emperor of China, which India says officially reaffirmed the traditional boundary. China, however, strongly counters this. Our sources report China's stance is that they didn't even send a representative to those 1842 negotiations, they never ratified the agreement, and get this, that the region of Xinjiang wasn't even a Chinese province yet to give consent. It is a classic clash of historical interpretation. All right, part 4, let's head over to the eastern sector, the McMahon Line, and something called the watershed principle. Jumping all the way across the Himalayas to the eastern side, we hit a totally different geographic logic, the watershed principle. Imagine drawing a line right along the absolute highest crests of a mountain range, where water falling on one side flows north and water on the other side flows south. India argues their boundary here legally follows this Himalayan watershed, citing it as a widely accepted international norm. And interestingly, they note China itself has used this exact same principle in other treaties. So for India, the legal bedrock in this eastern sector is the 1913 to 1914 Simla Agreement. The boundary was famously drawn as a red line on the treaty map, which you might know as the McMahon Line. But here is the major sticking point. That tripartite conference involved India, China, and Tibet. China disputes the treaty's validity entirely, arguing that it was concluded independently between Britain and Tibet, and crucially, that Tibet simply did not have the independent sovereign status required to sign international treaties. India counters that by stating that in 1913, Tibet had declared complete independence after the fall of the Manchu dynasty and therefore was fully empowered to sign without China's ratification. Which leads us to Part 5, the 1960 Evidence Board, and these totally clashing legal interpretations. By April of 1960, the leaders of both nations basically realized they had to put all their cards on the table. And what we see are two entirely different ways of looking at international law. India's stance leans heavily on original titles, treaties, and a long record of continuous, everyday civilian administration over the territories. China's stance is fundamentally different. They contend the treaties were either unratified or just invalid, they interpret the historical footprint differently, and they firmly demand that this entire undelimited boundary has to be negotiated fresh between the two modern governments. When you look at the official 1961 report that came out of these talks, the contrast in the evidence room was just stark. According to the source text, India submitted categorical documentation. We're talking ancient chronicles, tax and revenue records, surveys of border checkposts to prove administrative control. The report noted that China, on the other hand, relied on 2 secret maps, but did not produce corresponding ancient topographical details or administrative documents to authenticate their claimed alignment. Now again, we are just looking at what the 1961 official report states, but it perfectly illustrates why reaching a consensus was pretty much impossible. The evidence pools simply did not match. Finally, Part 6, the boundary dispute formula. Basically, why this conflict just keeps persisting. This is really the ultimate synthesis of why this standoff has been going on, quite literally, since the 1950s. We can boil the whole thing down to this formula. Different maps, plus different interpretations of history, plus incredibly high-stakes strategic interests, equals a very long conflict. Think about it. When one side points to the crest of a mountain and an 1842 treaty, and the other side points to the historical status of Tibet and the need for fresh modern negotiations, the overlap in their realities is zero. Literally zero. And, well, that zero overlap inevitably spilled out onto the actual ground. Following the 1962 military operations, where Chinese troops advanced up to, and in some cases actually beyond, their 1960 claim lines, the conflict paused, but it didn't resolve. The resulting line of actual control essentially cemented a fractured reality on the map. It is a massive frontier still defined today by differing historical realities, where the physical map on the ground just does not match the paper maps in the archives of either nation. So, knowing what we've unpacked today in this explainer about these overlapping treaties, the watershed principles, and those unyielding Himalayan mountains, I am going to leave you to ponder that question we started with. When history and geography fail to provide an answer that both sides can agree on, will power always be the thing that draws the final line? Think about that, and we'll see you in the next explainer.